Hello, guys, and welcome back to week 2 of our Unveiled Podcast Woven series. It seems like people really enjoyed the first one, and I'm excited about that.
Me too. It was fun to see how many people watched it and enjoyed it.
We got some questions from some congregation members. I have some questions, so let's get to week 2.
Okay.
All right, to start things out, I was stopped on Sunday, first of all, by a congregation member to just rave about how much they loved the video, which really made me happy. It was
awesome.
Really exciting. Yeah, because it feels like this is something that we've needed for a while, or something that has kind of been like in the wings for a while. So it was really awesome to get it going, and then to hear that people watched and they liked it just made it even better. Anyway, this congregation member said that in their Sunday school class, they talked for many minutes about the different slides that come with your Woven series, and in general, just the slides that you do for all of our sermon series and all of the sermons that you do. But they specifically wanted to know, A, how you come up with these slides. I think that they are like, oh my gosh, I think these just come out of nowhere. Like, they just are amazing, and they are. But I would really love for you to talk about the way that they come to be, because it is a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, first off, I would say that one of the awesome things about our church is how much all of us are contributing and pulling in directions. And so when we are able to do cool things like this podcast, it's your vision, my vision. They don't know this, but Everett is here too, helping out, producing. And so there's just a lot of things. And so one of the neat things about our church right now is that there's a lot of synergy and movement in the same direction. And I think those slides are a good example of that. So first off, it really wouldn't have been possible if we had not had all of the contributions to our campaign because of the brightness of the screens and things like that. And one of the things you might not see on the congregation is that I can see the slide in the back, whereas before, if I had done that, I would have had to always be looking to make sure things were going. So all of you that contributed, that's one of the fruits of this. The other huge person that makes this possible is Amber Lujan, who is kind of the secret sauce on all the things going on in worship, because I give her an outline, and she of what I'm going to say and kind of where to go on the slides. But really, if she wasn't there listening, and because every time you preach, it's a little bit different, and doing such a great job with that, it would be hard. I really liked that people told me it just seemed like to be switching out of nowhere, and that's because Amber is really good at her job and keeping things going. So I'm really blessed to work with her in so many ways. In terms of the slides themselves, we use a program called Canva that lots of people use, and I just like graphic design, and so I enjoy doing it. And it's been an interesting way to write my sermons. Usually, I would write an outline and a manuscript, but I've actually sort of begun by creating the slideshow and then doing everything else afterwards. So this Woven series, I wanted it to look kind of artsy. So the idea was to have, so everything's on the slides is on pieces of paper that kind of look like and just a thematic idea I had because of the idea of wovenness and this idea of kind of a craft that is weaving. But I really think that I wouldn't even attempt this if we didn't have such a great worship team all over the place. And so, I mean, Amber couldn't do her job if Bert wasn't doing his job. If it's all pulling in that direction.
Before we move to the next question, another question that was brought up was on the pictures that you use. Now, do those also come from Canva? Because what this Sunday school class was saying is that it just seems like they fit so perfectly for what you were saying. It seems like they were like drawn specifically for your sermon.
Well, there are a lot of tools that get used for that. So sometimes it's Canva. Sometimes I'm using AI. It sort of depends on what I find. AI is great some of the times, other times it's just a huge time waste. Some of the times what I'm doing is taking a picture that I find and then running it through a filter to make it look like it's artwork.
Nice.
So lots of tricks. That's what I'm trying to do.
Okay, so moving into your sermon from this past week,
Mm-hmm.
we talked about woven and agape as it comes to like marriage, bridegroom. And so one of the things that was coming up in my mind was how in the Bible we hear God call the church his bride. And we didn't specifically talk about that yesterday, but you kept saying like, agape and the way that God's love of agape should also be used in a marriage. And so that just kept coming to mind for me. So that's something that's very difficult for me to understand, why we call the church, why God calls the church his bride. Could you explain or maybe help me out with that a little bit?
Sure. So there's a lot there. One of the reasons that I used marriage was because when we think about love relationships, that's kind of one of the big things. And I didn't want the sermon to be entirely about just married relationships. Our church has many people who have lost spouses, many people who have had marriages that didn't work out. There's lots of variations on it. And even between the services, I had to kind of think about who was in the room. But it's true that it is one of the central metaphors in the Bible. And so just a little bit in the Old Testament, so before Jesus, some of the prophets will talk about Israel as an unfaithful spouse. So there is this idea that that metaphor is used. And obviously the primary way of understanding the relationship between God and Israel in the Old Testament is the language of covenant. And covenant is actually a legal idea. So some of y'all know, married to a German. And if you get married in Germany, you have a church celebration and a legal celebration.
Oh, interesting.
And the legal celebration is essentially, and this is no joke, a glorified filling out of a form, which I think is the most German thing possible. Like, you basically takes 15 minutes. They're like, "Is this your name?" Yes. And you're like, "Is this your?" But it reminds me that for most of human history, at least, for a long time, I was about to go on a tangent. For a long time, marriage was often seen more in economic terms, more of a almost contractual relationship. It was often kind of between families and all these kinds of things, and it was an economic unit. And so that's some of the background that the Old Testament used that metaphor to talk about basically when Israel was breaking a covenant, breaking the agreement in the way that was similar to in marriage. Jesus uses it, and he'll refer to himself as the bridegroom. So he would talk about that, and basically when people say, "Well, why aren't your followers fasting?" And he would basically say, "Look, this is almost a time of celebration." But in Revelation, probably most prominently talks in terms of the church as the bride of Christ. Now, there's a lot you could go there, but in terms of what we are talking about today, I do think that is about an agape relationship, this quality of love that we're talking about when we talk about the way God loves us. And one of the things that I wanted to do was, because in the modern understandings of which is fine, but when we think of the word love in English, we have so many other ideas about what it is, and we might not even know how to love when we don't like each other, and that's kind of what I wanted to get to. What would weave us together and bind us together when we don't see eye to eye?
Right.
And that's the way God is with us. So when we say God loves us, that doesn't mean that God is just like everything you're doing is awesome, or I'm but that there's this desire for our well-being, this willful delight, as we've talked about it, this willingness to sacrifice and give, and basically maintaining a relationship, even when most of the times we would want to break that relationship. Right. And we have so many relationships that are people that we really enjoy being around, but you see it these days. You find out they don't support the political candidate you support, or these kinds of things, and it will break that relationship. And I was interested in what could weave us together beyond those things. And so that's what, to me, agape love is. And if you look at the history of Israel, they are constantly breaking that covenant, and God is constantly coming back with more grace and more love, and the ultimate act of that is Jesus Christ himself. And so that's kind of an example of how God continued to agape love, even when I'm sure God was very annoyed.
Okay, so for our last question, yesterday we talked a lot about a threefold Christian, and we wrote them on our ribbons, and I just really would like you to tell us about a threefold Christian that you know or have interacted with or have a relationship with.
Well, I'm very blessed that I have a lot of folks that have been threefold cords for me, in the sense that they have poured in agape love. I think that's one of the blessings of working in churches, but particularly churches where there is a lot of this, of which our church is a great example of. But there are some really obvious choices for that, and that would be my parents and step-parents, both all pour and continue to pour a lot into me. My siblings and I are very close, and so there's all these people that I'm tied to in really deep ways that exemplify that kind of love, and of course the biggest example of that for me is my wife. But thinking a little bit in a way that would be not one of those obvious ones that you would hope. One of the things that I think is difficult about religion in America is that sometimes we don't talk about our faith. So even when we have relationships, friendships, there's a silence around it. We kind of think, well, that's your thing. And I even know spouses where so the husband will not be religious at all, and the wife will be very religious, and they love each other and all sorts of things, but there's just this part of their relationship that they can't talk about, that they can't kind of things. And so I worked with a worship leader really early in my career, and he's a young man, and the thing that struck me about working with him was that we were both concerned that we had a wonderful worship, and it was an exciting time. The Spirit was moving, and when I think about the resources we had versus what we have in our sanctuary, I've told John about this, but I was like, we sometimes, we just hope no one stepped on the cord and knocked out the whole worship, in the middle of things. Yeah. So it was a different level of organization, but there was so much Spirit in there. And one of the reasons that I think there was that Brandon knows his name, and I think had a real deep concern for the spiritual life of the other person. And so when we would worship plan, it wouldn't just be, let's talk about these events or that kind of thing. We would really be talking about kind of where God was moving us and accountability with one another. And there was a real spiritual fellowship there that was, I think, one of the reasons things really worked there. Mm-hmm. And it's harder to do when you have larger staff to have that kind of relationship. But one of the things that I really appreciated there was I always felt like that concern about faith and the other person's spiritual life and how they were growing with God, just even having that out there as a concern was a way that relationship was more than just a friendship or a work relationship. And eventually he needed to take a step and leave that church to go out on his own. And I knew that from a professional point of view, he was not replaceable. Like, I just knew this was going to be difficult. But from a spiritual point of view, I felt like it was absolutely the right thing for him to do. And so I saw almost that that even when like in a lot of ways I was like, oh gosh, it's gonna be tough, I felt just such a hand of grace at that whole thing, and he's done remarkable things, and so I think God was really at work there. So that's a threefold cord relationship. It's not a family member or a best friend or something like that. So still is a remarkable guy.
That's awesome. Yeah, when you were talking about it yesterday, I was thinking, we have these people in our life, parents, grandparents, that we think of like, oh, they're definitely a threefold Christian, but we realize that that's a family relationship, and if you really challenge yourself and push yourself outside of that box, you can find some really amazing people that you've walked with in your life. I am a music person and went to school for music, and finally found music. My family, my parents, God love them, put me in every sport imaginable when I was younger. Soccer, tennis, golf, softball, everything. Not my thing. I mean, not my thing. Not sporty at all. Like, hand-eye coordination, not great. Clumsy, doesn't really work with sports. But I was doing a musical at church, and one of the ladies that was helping with the music portion came up to my mom one day and said, you really ought to put her in music lessons and voice lessons. And so one day my mom drove me to this woman's house, and she told me that morning, just so you know, after school today, we're going to go to a lady's house and you're going to sing for her. So think of something to sing, and if you're good enough, then she may give you voice lessons. We'll talk about pressure. So sure enough, after school, we drive up to this woman's house. We walk in, and she has this huge baby grand piano. And I was immediately so intimidated. And before I even sang, she was telling my mom, I don't usually take girls until they're 15 years old. I was 11 at the time. I don't usually take girls until they're 15 years old because, we want their voice to be mature and all these different things. And so I sang Amazing Grace because I had sung at funerals, and that was kind of my only thing that I had really done, that in church. And so Amazing Grace was an easy one. And then she said, well, her voice hasn't matured yet, but I'd like to teach her. And she was the most amazing woman. She has since passed. Miss Glenn was like an aunt to me. I would go and see her once every week, once every 2 weeks, depending on what we had coming up as far as like concerts, or especially when I was getting ready for college, I would see her all the time. And we paid her a flat fee every week, but I think we would sit in there talking, and I'd be there for an hour and a half to 2 hours sometimes. And when I could drive, my mom knew like, oh, it's going to be a while. But I mean, she was just so amazing and had such a kindness and a generosity. And she worked at a church, and she was the music director at their church. So we would have voice lessons at her church, and she would have me come and sing at her church, which was awesome. And she was so easy to talk to. But one of the things that really struck me is she loved and was kind to everyone. She didn't have a favorite. She didn't have anybody that she never talked down upon anybody. She just was this amazing woman. And in fact, she would take me to my college auditions and would play for me instead of, they always provide you with an accompanist, but she would always say, oh, let me play for you. And so I was really sad. I mean, obviously when she died, it was almost like it shook my world, because I would come home from college, a college that she helped me get into, and she prepared me for these auditions, and I would come home and she would call me and say, let me take you to lunch. And we would, again, spend 2 to 3 hours sitting there talking about things. And she was amazing. And she would always weave God's grace into things. And, we could be talking about, I don't know, some boy that I had a crush on, and she would somehow weave God's love into it. And so it was like, okay, she was just so amazing. And so I wish that she was here today, that I could introduce her to my daughter and my son and my husband. And she's not, but she's just somebody that when I think of God's love and just exuberating God's love, that was just her. So.
Well, I think that's beautiful. It strikes me Mallory, being older now, in the first part of your life, you're on one side of that kind of relationship, being built up and poured into. And then
Right.
there comes a point, whether with children or with others, that you start being on that other side. And what strikes me is I just imagine how much delight she had watching you.
Mm-hmm.
I bet she just wanted to be at those auditions, just to see and have that willful delight we talked about. And so I know that I just feel in my heart that was a strong bond there, the kind of thing that I think is what agape love really looks like.
Right.
And you mentioned family. Next week we're going to kind of talk about family, but what's interesting is that in some ways these relationships are almost cleaner agape love relationships. Mm-hmm. And when you get family, you start getting agendas and all these kinds of things, even though in some ways they're the closest to agape love. In some ways they're where that's the most difficult. And so there's that's a beautiful image. And I'm grateful to her.
So I'm excited for next week to learn more about family relationships, because as you said, sometimes they're the easiest and sometimes they are the most difficult. But thank you guys so much for watching this week. Again, if you have a question that you would like for us to chat about related to the Woven series, please go ahead and send me an email. I'll put my email down below. But until next time, we'll see you then.